Thank you for coming today. My name is John Matsui, and I'm the instructor for this course that we'll be talking about today, MCB 15, the Public Engagement with Science. And I'm also the director and co-founder of the Biology Scholars Program. And I want the other panelists to introduce themselves, but there are also other people in the audience that have an association with MCB 15, including the person who first conceived of the course and founded the course. So, Ife?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Ifechukwu Okeke, and I'm an MCB neurobiology major and a former student of... Oh, okay. Thank you for letting me know. All right. Ifechukwu Okeke, MCB neurobiology major and a former student of MCB 15.
Thank you, Ife.
Hello, I'm Dax Ovid. I GSI'd for MCB 15 for a few iterations and also was a part of the design team for the course over 5 years now. I just want to also take a moment to acknowledge everyone in this room who, whether you have many years of teaching experience or you're a proactive early stage educator, you being here, your presence shows that you're really dedicated to creating inclusive classrooms, and thank you for coming.
Thanks, Dax. And now, Caroline?
I'm Caroline Kane. I, along with graduate students actually, who were the catalyst, started MCB 15 many years ago with multiple goals, the primary one being to show the relevance of science to those who are also concerned about their communities and about society in general, and to encourage students to voice their opinions in a larger classroom in situations where other places at Berkeley, as freshmen, sophomores, even juniors, they might feel a little uncomfortable voicing those opinions. So it was a classroom of respect for everybody.
Thank you, Caroline. And we have our two most recent GSIs for the course.
Hi, I'm Madeline Jensen. I'm a graduate student in MCB, and I was a GSI for the course last spring and helped with the course design last fall. And I really loved GSIing MCB 15. It was a great opportunity to really listen to the students. It was the first class I GSI'd where we were listening to the students and hearing their perspectives and really valuing them, and I hope that they felt like we were valuing them. And a lot of it was student-driven. They had a student-driven project, and that really stood out to me as a unique experience in MCB 15.
Thank you, Madeline.
Hey everyone, I'm Gordon Faribault. I am a fourth-year graduate student in the Plant and Microbial Biology department, and I was also working with Madeline, John, and Dax. In the fall, really developing the curriculum for MCB 15, and then GSIing in the spring.
Thanks, Gordon. And last but not least, a colleague from UCSF, social scientist, who's been helping us figure out why BSP works.
Hi, my name is Mika Estrada. I'm a social psychologist in the Social and Behavioral Science Department, associate professor over at UCSF. And I have been doing research and writing and supporting in various ways the Biology Scholars Program here.
Thank you, Mika. So Mika made a trip up from SoCal today just to be here. So thank you for doing that. So what's the day going to look like? Here's how we'll proceed. I'm going to talk about the goals, so the expectations of the workshop, and a little bit about the history of the Biology Scholars Program. I'm going to also give you a brief history of MCB 15. It's changed over the years since Caroline first began the course, along with Scientists of Color, a graduate student organization at the time. Then we're going to talk about the transferability. How transferable are some of the aspects of MCB 15 to our larger introductory required courses in the STEM fields? We're going to look at differences and similarities and also opportunities. I'm going to introduce the concept of the BSP Way. It sounds a little cultish, I agree. But it's shorthand for how do we approach addressing issues of underrepresentation in the classroom, in advising and mentoring, and so on. So that's the shorthand for the BSP Way. I'm going to cite a number of different studies and the literature to help support some of the things that we do. We're going to take a look at the relationship between what we've done in MCB 15 and the possible adaptations that you could make in your courses, and then we'll talk about the next steps beyond the workshop. And in order to facilitate the conversation, each of you should have a handout along with a 3x5 card with some Post-its on it. And all of this will become clear how we're going to be using this. On the first page, oops, sorry about that. Today's goals. What can you expect? First of all, we're going to be looking at what's transferable, how you can adapt various aspects. I don't expect replication. I don't want everybody to teach the public understanding or the public engagement with science. That's not the point here. There are pieces that can be borrowed, adapted, we believe, and that can help make your courses more inclusive. Also, I'm going to be presenting, along with my colleagues, models, ways to think about inclusion in our courses. Some people are looking for toolkits, easy solutions, plug and play, things that they can use immediately. And I think that oversimplifies the challenge that we face about including all of our students and increasing the chances for success of those students in our courses and in our disciplines. So let me tell you first about the Biology Scholars Program. Many of you in the room know about BSP, but let me just give you a brief history. In terms of the funding, Berkeley has funded BSP most recently, but over the 26 years, HHMI, the Harackiewicz Medical Institute, has been our primary source of funding. The goal of BSP, and this is an important goal, is to enlarge and diversify the pool of students that succeed in our majors and in related careers. I think that idea of enlarging and diversifying is really critical, rather than simply skimming those students who are already on their way to success. In terms of BSP members, over the last 26 years since Caroline and I co-founded BSP, there have been about 3,500 Berkeley undergraduates, 3,100 have graduated, and you can see the profile of the students, 60% underrepresented ethnic minorities, 70% women, 80% low income and first to college. This is a very unusual profile of students succeeding in STEM. In terms of success, BSP students generally, on average, come in less well prepared to perform in STEM here at Berkeley. In other words, their preparation, there's a gap between preparation and expectation here at Berkeley. However, nonetheless, the students, in spite of this different preparation level, graduate with biology majors in approximately the same percentage as intended majors at large, and with approximately equivalent exit GPAs. So in other words, my students have attained parity. In terms of MCB 15, what's the origin story? Caroline has already told you a little bit about that. Graduate students of color really wanted to initiate a course that connected science with the larger community. And since then, it's evolved. In terms of the critical junctures, there have been a number of twists and turns and adaptations that we've made over the years. First of all, the course focus. It is a topics course, which means that we get to choose what topics we talk about. We would choose everything from climate change to attitudes towards vaccinations and so on. But more and more, we began to realize over time that students were really challenged, especially first to college students, students who came from under-resourced communities. They were challenged by explaining what they were learning at the university to their families and friends. In other words, how do you talk about your science to people who aren't at the university, in fact, who aren't in the STEM fields? And so we changed our focus to the public understanding of science. But we revised our thinking after much consideration because we thought that this was sort of a deficit model. They didn't understand, and we do. And that stance is not a stance that invites participation. And so we reframed the course and the title in terms of the public engagement with science, how we engage with the public, how the public engages with science. And so it's a two-way street of engagement. And I think that reframing is really critical. Now, in terms of the role of the GSI, please, Dax.
Thank you. In a moment, I'll ask Madeline and Gordon if they'd like to add anything from their experience serving as GSI this past spring semester. Two things really stood out to me in my experience serving as a GSI and designing the course. One was that this was an opportunity for me to contribute to students getting able to build their social networks, to really connect not just with the culture of science, but also with their friends, their family, and communities of importance to them, usually including groups from people with shared backgrounds and identities. Another aspect of my experience as a GSI that really stood out to me was being able to create conditions of possibility for students to fulfill on what matters to them. Students are given agency in deciding what are the skills that I want to develop, what are the strengths that I want to harness, what are the communities I want to work with and make a difference for. And those were just a couple of the things that stood out to me in my experience as a GSI. Would Gordon or Madeline like to add anything? Is there the mic? Oh, thank you.
Thank you. So one of the things that, well, there are two things. The first thing is what I think stood out to me was the ability to work with a great team of people, really at creating lectures, inviting guest speakers, to talk about topics that can empower students and empower them by validating their experiences within STEM courses and within laboratory spaces. So that's one. And then the second thing that I think is unique about MCB 15 is, sorry, let me catch my breath. I think the second thing that's important is we had a unique opportunity to really co-create knowledge with students by the way it was set up. So we had lectures, and then we had deeper dive sessions. And so in those deeper dive sessions, we were able to really hear like what students are thinking, learning about their experiences, and them sharing with other people in their classes how their different experiences kind of relate to the lecture topics. And so I think that really created a lot of fruitful information and learning on both our parts, but also the students' parts.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Gordon.
I would just add that there was a huge level of trust in the room, and a trust among the students and a trust between the instructors and the students, and that was really required for the course to succeed. But it also felt different from a lot of Berkeley courses where I think the students feel like they're competing with one another to succeed. And here they were all helping each other succeed, and that was just really cool to see.
Thank you so much, Madeline. Okay.
And to add on to that, what John was saying earlier about the change in the topic. So I hadn't taken a class before where, and he explained this at the beginning of the class, it's like from shifting from titling it Public Understanding of Science to Public Engagement with Science, to me was really cool because at the end of the day, we are at an academic institution and we do know how this pyramid of knowledge production goes and how communities oftentimes are sort of imposed on in terms of this is what you need and this is what we need to do for you because we've gone to school and now we're better. And thinking about the fact that in this exchange, in communicating science, in learning about science, communities also have things to contribute to us, even though they might not know what a mitochondria is, right? And so I thought it was really, really great to have that as a first introduction and something to keep in mind throughout the course of the semester, because every time that you would see the class and you would see that topic, you would be reminded of the fact that this is a two-way street and that whatever we're doing here centers communities and puts us as people who are collaborating with rather than doing things for the public.
Thank you. Thank you, Ife. So I'm being really conscious of the time because I want you all to have enough time to do the work around your coursework. So let's see if we can move through this. Do you want to save this?
Yes.
And
We'll go into the process reflection exercise a little bit later. One comment I'll just say in relation to that and for the entirety of the talk is this theme of co-creation, collaboration, co-construction is going to come up over and over again. So that's what I'll highlight, and we'll go into the discussion of the pre later on.
And the deeper dive is something that Gordon talked about, and we'll talk about it, and you'll be talking about that in greater detail later. And the project is something that maybe you want to just quickly mention right now, Dax.
Yeah, I'll give a summary of the project. This was another facet of the course that we don't have enough time to discuss today. We could do a whole workshop on it. It was the opportunity for students to work with an audience of their choice in the community, to pick a topic that's relevant and important for that community, and to co-construct a project. And I don't know if you'd like to share your project for the course.
So my project was trying to understand ways that underrepresented students who are interested in research could get involved, but also when they do get involved, how they can be supported by their labs and by the environment that the labs create. And so our question actually evolved over the course of the semester. So at first, it was kind of like more about access, but we had to send out a survey to our audience in, like an unbiased way and make sure that we weren't asking questions that were only prompting certain questions, certain responses. And then depending on what we got, as far as these people are interested in research, what would they like to see, we had to modify our project to actually target and cater more to the fact that students who are in labs don't feel like they're supported or don't feel like they have enough mentorship. And so we had to add that facet to our project and sort of shift away from access to research or to lab opportunities and more on how can the space and, those who work in these environments support those students more. And so it wasn't what I thought students out there needed, which of course a lot of the time would be like, yes, they need research and lab opportunities. It was actually more about the people who were there and what they did need. If we're going to say that more students should get into labs, well, the labs should be able to cater to these students better.
Thank you, Ife. Yeah. So let's move on. The course features. Dax, you want to go through this?
Oh, sure. So just a little bit about MCB 15. The focus is public engagement with science, 60 to 100 students, mostly STEM majors, largely biology-focused STEM. And we had 2 lectures a week, one of which was a deeper dive, which we'll describe a little bit more later, and a discussion section, which was like the studio for students to work on their project that Ife just described her project for. 99% of our course were BSP members or applicants, and it was a required course for the Biology Scholars Program members. And John will go over some sample lecture topics.
So the lecture topics, just to give you a taste of what we covered, and these topics were chosen by the design team, but also generated from the evaluations and the interest of students. And so here are a list of topics, and you could read for yourself what these are. But I think what is most important about this is that I see these topics as being responsive to what the students were asking for. And embedded in these topics were, it was a combination of social science, science, any number of intersections of disciplines. We had guest speakers, and we'll talk a little bit about one of the guest speakers and the types of questions her comments generated. And so, again, These topics changed over the years. There were some, like on being a scientist, where we invited a scientist from integrated biology to come and speak. Some of those remained the same, but we responded to what students were asking for. In terms of the differences and similarities, Dax.
Thank you. So already you might be thinking, this isn't really teaching science, or this is an elective, so students can choose whether or not they want to take it. It's not a prerequisite. It's a smaller course. Some people are teaching courses 500, 800 students, I saw from the pre-survey people completed. And also the student demographics, since most of them are coming from the Biology Scholars Program, that this is a unique group of students that we have the opportunity to get to work with. However, there are some similarities that John and I saw in our conversations in planning for this workshop that are relevant for lower division STEM courses and other STEM courses. For example, the majority of our students are STEM, and they're taking your classes if you're teaching a STEM course. We have a lecture and a discussion section. We have instructors GSI, same format. Engagement and attendance challenges, the students who stop showing up in the middle of the semester, students who prefer to surf the web than engage in lecture, the same types of challenges any instructor at a higher education institution suffers. And also classroom constraints. We're using the same classrooms you are, and it's graded. So there's some transferability given this overlap and similarities that are between MCB 15 and other lower division STEM courses that John will go into greater detail around.
And in fact, this is going to be the bulk of the rest of this first hour. We're going to be talking about three things. These are the opportunities that we identified, Dax and I identified as possible points of transferability, where you can actually take aspects of MCB 15 and import these things with adaptations into your courses. Work with the GSIs in terms of their selection, what their role is, and also what their training is. Also, this process reflection exercise. How can that be adapted? It was an assignment. It was a way in which we tried to engage students. We kept track of what they were thinking about the material and so on. Possibilities there. That's an opportunity. And also in terms of course assessment, evaluation and assessment of how we're doing in our courses. It's very contentious. And in fact, we have critics both on and off campus who say that our evaluations are measuring unimportant things, not really the types of things that we want to be measuring. And we see the pre as a possibility, as a possible source of more information in a formative way to give us an idea of how we're doing. And last but not least, the deeper dive. The deeper dive. We see possibilities in terms of your discussion sections, using some of the aspects of the deeper dive within the context of discussion. So we were looking for ways in which, sort of starting points, where we can actually make connections between what we did and other lower division STEM courses. What you have on the front of your handout is an inventory worksheet. It's on the first page. And let me just talk about that. You're going to be doing some work here starting right now. There are going to be three areas that you're going to be evaluating as we speak. So think about your course. And as you think about your course, use this inventory to indicate the instructional value within the context of the course that you're thinking about in terms of its value, that is the facet of one of those three areas of our course. Think of the value on a scale of 1 to 4, 4 being very valuable. Also think about the feasibility of actually doing, importing, adapting this aspect of our course in your course. And we're going to be doing this for the GSI role, the pre, and the deeper dive. And so be critical, and this inventory is going to serve as really the driver for our second hour and the conversation we have around your courses and the challenges that you face and maybe some of the opportunities that you see in adapting some of these aspects. One of the things that we recognize, and Madeline, in fact, referred to this environment of trust, which isn't always the case in many of our courses, where competition is really fierce and students aren't trusting one another, and maybe there's a lack of trust between instruction and the students. And when we talk about the climate of STEM, it's a matter of vantage point. Depending upon your role within that climate, the amount of power you have, your background, there are any number of variables. Our focus over the last 26 years has been on individuals who don't fit the historic profile of success in STEM at Berkeley. We've looked at individuals who, in fact, aren't considered to be Berkeley material, let alone material for STEM. And so we've been looking at outsiders. And there's a bunch of really relevant, applicable literature that I think is worth looking at briefly to inform our considerations, our thinking here. One study is about counterspaces for women of color in STEM, especially in those STEM fields where there is a high underrepresentation of women. Astrophysics, some of the more mathematically based STEM fields, where women are a distinct and discrete minority. In this article, Mia Ong and her colleagues describe STEM disciplines in the following way. Now again, this is from the perspective of individuals who have to function, highly function within the STEM field. The prevailing culture and structure of STEM disciplines favor competitive, individualistic, and solitary practices. In other words, this idea of individuals succeed. Many of us in the room don't adhere to that. We, in fact, have teams and colleagues and collaborators and so on. But from the perspective of an outsider, this may seem daunting because they're not part of the inside group. These norms are typically associated with white male scientists. And the result is that individuals who don't fit the profile feel marginalized if they don't adhere to this notion that we succeed on our own, work is done individually, and so on. And what this does is to create the need for counterspaces. And what these counterspaces are safe spaces. And in the interview that Mia did with successful women of color in STEM, they all talked about these safe spaces that they created for themselves. And here we're talking about senior faculty, women who were senior faculty. We're talking about postdocs. We're talking about graduate students and how they managed to not only survive but thrive within this culture that was just described. These safe spaces allowed them to promote their own learning, where their experiences were validated. These experiences were viewed as critical knowledge. And so these safe spaces provided a chance for them to talk about their experiences. And those experiences were something that were considered to be real rather than simply perceived and, maybe overly dramatizing their situation. They were able to vent their frustrations. And as I'm reading this off, think about your courses and think about if, in fact, there are safe spaces in your courses that allow individuals who may not fit the profile to be able to do this. So stories were shared and people talked. And the last, and it's an important point, they were able to challenge deficit notions about the groups or individuals from the groups to which they belonged. And this idea that, who can do science? They called those deficit notions into question. They reinforced each other's, they affirmed each other's abilities, and so on. These safe spaces were really critical, and they were mentioned over and over again in the study. In another study, and Mika Estrada,
John, can I
I'm sorry, please.
On the previous slide, all of these, and if you think back to a couple of slides ago where there were topics from the course, if you remember, there were topics like the history of science. And I was just like, I didn't know there was a history of science. and that's because very important things like that are not talked about often as students. You just come in and you just sort of start learning content. And being in a lab, and how labs have like cubicles and like individual desks and stuff like that, and then you meet like once a week for a lab meeting or whatever. There's just this very, like the first lab I was part of, it was just very like strange to me walking in, and I would just sort of go to everyone's desk like, hey, what's up? And people would look at me like I had two heads. And I realized it's because of the culture. So like John mentioned, white European, the culture of like people whose science was first valued, and thinking about how that sort of spilled into the rest of us. And so learning that and understanding that made me think like, what if, science done by Black people was first valued? Maybe labs would look very different, for example, or maybe the culture of science and how scientists interact with each other, or, whose work is valued. Like maybe, publishing by yourself wouldn't be something that's as valued as like if you publish with like a bunch of people in science. And so for me, it was very important and critical to think about how that shows up today. And then this slide is just one of my favorite slides ever, because
the next one,
this one right here,
this one,
because it's talking about what people would consider to not be real research, or what people would say are like your feelings, right? And it really is, it was validating for me. And also John is going to talk about Mika's research, because she presented it at one of the meetings we had with all the BSP students. And I remember a bunch of us just going to her and being like, wow, that just felt so validating to see our feelings, to see the things that we experience on a daily basis be valued and be published and be on paper, since that's like the method of communication we respect. And at the end of the day, though, these are things that people go through on a daily basis, and things that really do affect how you perform in class. And to know that it's valued and that other people are experiencing the same thing, and that people who are teaching your classes understand and look out and value that in designing their coursework just really adds a lot to your experience. So I wanted to point out the fact that, this idea of like social science research not being really science, or not really tying into science, or science being like this very rigid, empirical field or empirical subject that only deals with facts, is actually very false, and just comes from a culture that some of us cannot relate to. And so to me, as a scientist or as a budding scientist, I would want to come into science classes, science spaces, communities, with all of myself and my frustrations and my experiences, and hope and expect that there's room for all of that in an ideal situation.
Thank you, Ife. So this next slide is a chart that appears, a diagram that appears in an article that Mika was lead author, and it's about kindness and community and success in STEM. And as I recall, Mika, you and I were sitting in my office, and just instead of this was the back of the envelope sort of thinking that we did, but we were trying to describe environments that were exclusive and inclusive. And we wanted to talk about not just micro and macro aggressions, but micro and macro affirmations. And so Mika came up with this idea of how to represent all of that. And on the left side here, we see a prejudiced institutional environment having both high micro and macro aggression. In other words, it's really, really clear that you don't belong. All the messages, both public, are we don't want you. In the interactions, we don't want you. And so that is a clear environment. On the left side, an inclusive institutional environment, you have high micro and macro affirmation. In other words, the message is consistent, both public and private, in your interactions on an individual as well as a very public level, that you belong. Where is UC Berkeley? I had an idea, and based on my conversations with students, that maybe we are in this ambiguous state. We're in between, where we have high microaggression and high macro affirmation. Now, how can that be? What's Berkeley's motto? Excellence and diversity. That's the macro affirmation. Welcome. excellence and diversity are compatible. But in the laboratory, in advising sessions, when you're not chosen as a lab partner because the assumption is that maybe you're not smart enough and you'll pull down the group, all these sorts of things play out. This ambiguous state is problematic. But to test this idea, what I did was I surveyed in MCB 15 the students, and this was in the spring. And what you see, I put a scale of 1 to 5 going from prejudice to inclusive institutional environment. And I had students vote, expressing their experience, both in the general, that is the campus-wide environment, as compared to the STEM environment. And here are the tallies. Here are the tallies of their experiences within the STEM as well as the general environment. And what was really interesting is that if we graph this out, we see that STEM is far less inclusive in terms of how students have experienced that environment. Now, it's a small sample size. Most of the students were in BSP. This would be interesting if we scaled this up and made this a much more rigorous study, but this was something that Mika and I had talked about doing. But these preliminary data are pretty suggestive. And so when we think about how inclusive our classrooms are, how students are experiencing, and I'm not talking about students in general, but students broken out by background. Because again, it's a matter of vantage point, and background matters. How one is perceived and treated, all of this matters. So what is this BSP Way? The BSP Way is something that I'll describe to you. It's something that we've been working on for over the last year to try to capture, because people say, what do you do to get those results? And so we've been trying to figure out how to describe in a really simple way how we do it. And the it is how we advise, how we mentor, and in this case, how we teach. What is the BSP Way? The BSP Way first involves creating a climate of inclusion, a climate of kindness. And we identified 4 different factors that were part of a cycle that we believe happens in advising, mentoring, and teaching. First of all, we own the problem, that is the problem of underrepresentation. It's not a student problem, it's our problem. It's a problem that we want to take ownership of. Secondly, we want to use evidence and research to determine how we think about the problem as well as what we do about this challenge. Co-construction is something that we've mentioned any number of times. That is to say, working with one another, but most importantly, working with our students to co-construct solutions and success. And finally, in terms of what we want an outcome to be, we designated this as navigational capacity, the capacity to have the skills and knowledge to be able to change things. Navigational capacity. And so let's take a look at the ownership as well as the use of evidence as a way to kind of drive our thinking, as well as the shared responsibility for success. One of my recent papers just came out in Cell Biology, Education, Life Sciences, and this was a 26-year retrospective on BSP. Looking back, exactly what are some of the most important lessons? For today, the lessons that I think are most relevant to our consideration of coursework and inclusive teaching. Number 1, we need to fix our institutions and not our students. And part of our institution, of course, are the courses that we teach. But of course, it involves also how we advise, how we mentor, and so on. Secondly, we need to base our actions on evidence, data, and research, and this is what we've been trying to do. And just to be honest with you, in the beginning, I was going by my intuition. I was doing things based upon what I felt would work. And after the fact, I looked for the evidence. And it seems as if I've been fairly on. My thinking, because maybe I've listened a lot to my students, has resonated with what the research says. And we co-construct success with our students using their stories and behavior as data. We listen to our students, and we do more than listen. We really kind of analyze what they're saying about a situation, such as coursework, such as advising, such as mentoring, and we do something with that information, again, referring back to the literature. And so in summary, and this is what Ife was talking about earlier, we do things with our students, not to our students. And I think that's a very different sort of feeling, whether that be in a classroom, in advising, in terms of a mentoring situation.
Yeah. And I was going to add the number one, which is like fixing the institution, not the students, is huge because students, I tend to feel like, you know, we're not good enough for this, or, you know, if you don't understand something, that it's your fault that you don't understand it, and maybe you should like read the book more or like figure out study strategies. But sometimes, and what I've heard, you know, like good science is good science if the person you're communicating it to can understand you, right? So it's like if you do all this work and this like world-class research institution, but people don't understand the point of your work, then it's sort of on you to go back and try to figure out how best to communicate that. And scaling that up to the institution is like, well, if certain students are having a harder time, rather than thinking and saying like, you know, if only they worked harder, if only they were smart enough, they would do better, figuring out what is it that's wrong with my maybe not wrong, what could I do differently with my process, and how could I go about the things that I'm doing to make sure that by listening to these students and by working with these students, we're catering to them. And so I think that John puts it as co-constructing success, but it really does feel like our input and our perspectives are valued. Like the things that we say we need, we see, right? It's not like, oh, let's just, which I've experienced, let's just get student input, but here is what we're going to do, but we want to make them feel like they're listened to, just because that's a prerequisite or whatever. And so you really do see that the things that you hope for and the things that you feel like would make for a better experience do happen and are put into practice, you know, and before any major decision is made, like we're consulted. It makes me feel like, wait, who are we? Why are you asking us what you want? But that is a fundamental aspect of, you know, how we move through this program. And I think that for you to say that that really does validate the success means a lot and tells me that it does work, you know, because I just wonder, like, what would happen if a PI said to their undergrad student, like, what are your interests and what do you hope to gain from this, you know, experience, for example? That's something that sounds like such a simple conversation, but doesn't happen that often. You're just sort of, first of all, if you get into a lab, you're very lucky, so you better just value it and stick with it, right? Second of all, whatever you're doing in the lab, it just has to fit into this bigger picture, and catering to the student in terms of what their interests are, co-constructing, thinking about what they would hope to gain might make that a better experience for not just the student, but the lab as well. That's just an example.
And just to give you context, Ife just came from a summer at Yale, working as part of the XROP program, the HHMI Exceptional Research Opportunity Program, where she had the opportunity to do research. And your PI had the opportunity to do research with you as well. Yes. And the PIs are HHMI investigators. Yeah. And so, you know, it's not for wanting to get into a lab. Ife has been very successful, and these reflections that she gives you are sort of an account of the path that she's taken and the frustration she's experienced.
Right. I made that face because I didn't want to be put on blast like that, but yes.
Sorry, Ife.
No, you're good.
Your story needs to be told. Okay. And so we have this co-construction, but what is this navigational capacity that I referred to earlier? I didn't know that term before this year, okay? I just knew I wanted leaders, I wanted open-ended problem solvers, I wanted people who could actually act without a program and without a structure actually to be part of, but they were able to create for their own selves an opportunity, a structure that was going to work. And so I found this term, navigational capacity, and in this article, here's what the author puts out there. Marginalization reduces the capacity to aspire. I think we can all relate to that. And the conditions that prevent building a culture of aspiration. That's what we're trying to do, aren't we? To help students kind of hold on to their dreams, to help students continue to aspire to greatness. And here are the things that keep that from happening. Policies and practices that reinforce the norms and inequalities, such as You know, a weekend review, of course you're going to hold a review session on the weekend, but many of our students work on the weekends, or they have family responsibilities on the weekends. How equitable is that? Or the early drop date that was being proposed in L&S earlier, before the first midterm. How do you gauge whether or not you should drop or continue with a course? If you have a lot of higher education capital, cultural capital, maybe you can ask friends and family about the decision. But if you're the first to go to college, that's an inequitable situation. Lack of voice to change conditions, and Ife has spoken volumes about this. Chances to be heard. Think about your course. Think about how many opportunities, besides maybe the final evaluation that happens, for student voice to be heard and taken seriously, and something to be done with what they say. And finally, unequal access to pathways, systems knowledge. You're at a distinct disadvantage if you're the first in your family to go to college, or if you come from an under-resourced background where you haven't had the opportunities to know the types of things that are really critical in terms of shaping your success. So having a culture of aspiration provides this navigational capacity. It's a map, it's the knowledge, it's knowing the path. It's all of those things that are so critical, and we in this room know that for ourselves. And so think about navigational capacity. How do you build that in your courses? So let me turn this over to Dax, because I think in terms of navigational capacity for both the instructors as well as for the students, MCB 15 has built in some structural qualities.
Great, thank you. You've heard a little bit already about the development team. There were graduate student instructors, and John was the head professor. And what I think is important to emphasize is that Professor John Matsui did a lot of work to prepare for weekly meetings that we had, to ensure that there was structure, that there was research for us to reference with regards to STEM education practices. And the conversation was fruitful because of that background work that John had provided. Firstly, it involved owning the problem. This problem of having students who are in a course. Most courses are unidirectional. There's someone up in front talking the whole time, and there's the room full of people that never get to share what's on their mind. How do we actually get to engage them? How do we actually get to discover what it is that they're thinking? And we developed the pre and the deeper dive, which I'll go into detail after this. But this was something that the development team created to work together on owning the problem around student engagement in a STEM course, and making that engagement inclusive. Again, using evidence. John was able to look up, like, what are the most relevant papers that connect to this course, that connect to higher education in STEM, that connect to students from marginalized groups. And these were articles that we used to discuss. So we not only had student experiences and stories, but also validating research that complemented what we were observing. From this, we co-constructed the course. And I can honestly say, from the other courses I've taught at Berkeley, this was the only one where I was asked, like, what do you think we should teach? What are your ideas? Let's brainstorm. And to have the input that I had and the interest that I had considered in the co-construction of the course was really validating. The making pro-social connections with science was something that was essential for me to even be motivated to continue staying in science. What's the point? Why are we doing all this research, spending billions of dollars every year? There is a point, and there are some pro-social connections that we can make, and that not only for the graduate students, but also for the students in the course as well. And through this process, which is built off of the BSP Way, developing that navigational capacity for the graduate student instructors to also be able to go out into the world, to go out and to teach another course and design a course ourselves, to be able to speak up in future courses that we might be instructing, or to conduct research in areas that are truly of interest to us. And that navigational capacity was something that was fostered in the weekly meetings that we had as a development team, both the fall before we started the course and during the actual course in the spring. How did we engage the students in this process? I'm really excited to share a couple of the areas that we thought of in response to owning some of the problems we observed in the classroom. And this is the process reflection exercise and the deeper dive. You can look in the packets and you'll see samples of what these particular things are. The process reflection exercise is a packet that students collect at the beginning of the class. They pick them up, they fill them out, answer the questions, and then they return them at the end of class. This was a concept that we developed in response to a few different observations we had of previous iterations of the course. Firstly, some students come in pretty late, or some students leave early. There's a lot of competing demands. How is it that we make this course worthwhile for them to come on time and stay the duration of the course? Because presence is a prerequisite for engagement, right? We included in the grading rubric an opportunity to be explicit with students that we're looking at punctuality and we're looking at integrity and staying the duration of the course as a part of their grading. Beyond that, this is a sample of the pre that was modeled last semester in the spring with Gordon and Madeline. And I'll just focus on a couple of points. The first question here, what have your experiences been with this topic? How is it relevant to your life? This is a question that's modeled off of a study done by Tanner. It's in the list of references in the packet as well, showing that students who make a connection between their personal lives and this topic, the research, whatever it is the content of the course is, facilitates learning, perform better on tests. And this is an opportunity for students to actually think for themselves, what are the connections? What's my pre-existing knowledge? How do I connect this new concept, this new knowledge with that? Another thing I'll point out on the pre is the last point. Given this material, what would you tell your younger self or a close relative about science or careers in science? And I love this question. It's an opportunity to not only think about how do I translate this, how do I create a third culture with people that I'm close to or with a younger version of myself, it's also an opportunity to think about careers in science, starting to make those connections for the future, living into that future for who can I be in science? What could I tell other young people who are interested in science, who share my background and identity? And making that one course class material connect with that, both the past self and the future self. Now I'll take a moment to talk about a few facets of the deeper dive. The deeper dive took place on the second lecture of the same week, and it was in response to the lecture that we had earlier in the week. We would invite guest speakers from different departments, statistics, anthropology, sociology, whatever piqued our interests as graduate student instructors and whatever we thought the students would be interested in as well. Those speakers would come and present on Tuesdays, and then on Thursdays we would do a deeper dive where we might do a close reading of some of the particular points that came up in lecture that we thought would be interesting and could develop discussion with the students. We would also look at the responses that students had written on their pre's and factor that into the deeper dive conversation. Here's a sample question that was a deeper dive that followed Dr. Laura Nader's lecture. She was the first woman faculty member in the anthropology department here at UC Berkeley. And just to give you a taste of that, these are some of the questions that we would pose to students. They would work in groups of 3 to 4 and discuss these questions, sometimes around the culture of science, in relation to their own experiences. And here's another sample question. When a group thinks alike, then brains are redundant. Sometimes there's these little sparklets of quotes that we hear speakers say that we just really want to capture and put a magnifying glass over. And what I really appreciate about this as an example is we're bringing the discussion of diversity into the classroom. It's not just us versus them. It's not the equity and inclusions over here, STEMs over here. STEM isn't STEM without diversity. How do we have this conversation in the classroom? How do we define it? Let's give the students a chance to discuss it and share out. And this is a sample of a deeper dive, which is also in the packet as well. We wanted to ensure that the groups were inclusive in their conversations as well. So you might notice the small print at the bottom. Students were asked to evaluate themselves. Did I create an inclusive space for sharing and encouraging my peers to express their viewpoints? Also, how did you manage your own individual voice and silence to allow yourself and others to build off of ideas formed in the group? Responding to something someone else said, showing that you were listening. Some basic concepts that come from facilitation practices that while we couldn't all be in each group and moderate, this was at least something to prime students to engage in their breakout discussions in an inclusive manner. Just to summarize the three facets, the GSI role, the process reflection exercise, and the deeper dive. I hope that you got a little bit of a sense of how we took on each of those aspects of the BSP way and developing them, iterating them, and applying them in the course. Repeat. So I'll pass it back over to John to discuss the second half of the workshop with the inventory worksheet.
Thanks, Dex. So the plan was for you to use that inventory on the first page, but maybe I wasn't clear enough about how to use that, and so I don't know how many people did use that inventory, scoring from 1 to 4 for some people did. You didn't. Okay, so what I want you to do is I want you to take a look at the 3 categories, the pre's, the GSIs, and the deeper dive, as we've described them. And as Ife has talked a little bit about her experience as a student in the course last semester, I would like you to pick out any facet that, in fact, for you, has high value and high feasibility. Is this the best way to go? Let's stop and think about this. Since you weren't doing the inventory as you were going along, I think what may be better is to open up the floor to conversation, structured around each of those areas, the GSI, the pre, and the deeper dive, and let's just talk. I think that might be a better way. What do you think? What do you think? Think that's better? Because you have questions. You have questions that are around transferability, how the utility of these approaches, whether or not this is going to work within the context of your courses. Why don't we do it that way? Are we agreed? Okay. So let's consider the GSI role. And Dax, do you want to go over this with them?
Sure. Oh, pardon me, Ife. Oh, thank you. Perfect. Okay, so each of the facets listed under GSI role may have a certain value to you, but there's also a certain feasibility aspect. And I'm curious from hearing from the audience, each course, whether you're a GSI and you've been selected to teach a course, or you're a professor and you've had to go through a selection process, is there a particular facet that stands out to you as being particularly valuable and feasible? Or something maybe you're already doing?
I'm thinking maybe a better starting point is for you to ask us questions. For you to start off with your questions, please.
So, John, when the university system is set up with either having lecturers or GSIs that aren't hired and begin their employment until possibly a week before classes start, that seems like an administrative predicament that it's a roadblock to be able to do some of the things that you'd like to do in that, in at least for the pre-instruction meetings that you'd like to do. Yes. How do we change that culture here?
I could respond to that. Before I started grad school, I was so excited to teach. I was already watching all of the lectures online for the course I was going to teach. Maybe not all grad students do that, but I was so excited. Went through the textbook, and I think that no one reached out to me. I knew that I was going to teach that course coming in until like the courses start. So I think it's a combination of let's wait till the paperwork comes in to give people the opportunity to contribute versus just like reaching out and seeing if anyone is interested in being a part of a little bit of a co-construction process. It might not be for everyone, and not everyone may be enthusiastic and excited to be a GSI, but I see a starting point is giving them the opportunity to declare that for themselves.
So let's problem solve. If co-construction and if building on information from the past, but adding sort of your take on a situation, incorporating some fresh new ideas and perspectives, if that's the desired state, but you have a compressed time frame. In fact, it may be a real-time time frame. How do you do that? What are the resources available such that those resources can be used in a situation that you've just described? Oftentimes, it's just simply asking who taught the course before, and maybe asking them for their slide deck, for their syllabus, for their handouts, for their materials. What more could we do besides that, given the reality, given the fact that people are hired oftentimes so late? Does anybody have any ideas? What do you think? Please.
I have something really small, but I've only discovered it recently, that we can give out $75 gift cards for people's extra service. And so maybe you can contact a graduate student prior to the semester and say, hey, we have this opportunity. Could you contribute somehow? Or would you like to? What would you like to do? And though they're not on the payroll yet for their GSI position, you can offer them something for their contribution and get that head start maybe for the semester.
I see. Okay. Please.
I think, too, in the time that it would take to build a consistent GSI community that can kind of revolve through the course and generate these slide decks and things, you could start to build on the undergraduates that you've had come through as UGSIs. So an undergrad who takes the class, starts a project while they're a student, continues it through UGSIing, working with the GSIs, and then you just keep going.
So in other words, you would incorporate the student voice and maybe their history and build on that. Yep. And we have a discontinuous history, don't we? Undergraduates graduate, and we don't really have a way to catalog and to build. And maybe we need to do that. Because student voice is very important in terms of the development of MCB 15. Other ideas?
I'd also just like to chime in. If you have a pen and are willing and able to fill this out and turn it in at the end, it would be valuable for us to be able to see what the value and feasibility was of the group.
Any other questions about the role of the GSI? GSI training. GSI training. What's it like now? Can any of what we talked about be incorporated into GSI training? What are your thoughts? I'm looking at some of my colleagues and biology colleagues, yeah? Any ideas?
I'm not really sure what GSI training there is now. I know we have a class in IB for GSIs, right? And I don't know what's covered in there, but that's what I was thinking when you were like in a GSI meeting that we typically have. It seems like for our lab courses, it's they're learning the content of the class, they're not talking about making a safe space or all these really fabulous things that you're talking about. I mean, this seems like a whole separate course, and this should be done in a GSI training course to teach them how to teach, right? So I don't know how this would be done. I don't know, or just spend 15 minutes at every GSI meeting going over this, just so you're aware and conscious maybe? I don't know.
Thank you, Jill. Any other ideas about how to incorporate this into the training of our GSIs? Yeah.
Well, there are the 375 GSI courses that most GSIs are required to take.
Yes.
And I've had the privilege of teaching
Bob, you want to
one of them.
Say who you are.
Well, I'm Bob Fisher. I'm now emeritus professor in plant and microbial biology, and I still teach biology 1A. And 3 weeks ago, I was in a rehabilitation hospital for a long time, but I came out of it, and now my health is back, and I grabbed my course back. And in the 375, we would go over at least some of these issues. Knowing how to teach means knowing how people learn, know how yourself learns, know what your own prejudices are in terms of learning and expressing things and how you think and how other people might think and how other people from different backgrounds might think and how you can create a safe space for them to open up and let their way of thinking out so you can understand perhaps what they need, how important listening is, because that's how you can understand what they're thinking, is you have to create this very safe space where they can speak and you listen in a very non-confrontational way and let them keep going. Don't just jump in and start correcting them. Let them go for a little while and then do it very gently. Honor every question. And creating a safe space, just for everybody. And I was still learning how to teach the class when you took it, and I'm still learning how to teach it now. So,
thank you.
So it sounds like Jill brought up GSI training taking place in the weekly meetings, taking 15 minutes to discuss inclusive practices, and Bob talks about listening. Like, it might not be just training is talking at grad students about this is how you teach, but hearing from the graduate students, learning from the undergraduate students, what needs to happen to create an inclusive space. Thank you.
Hi. Something that I'm thinking about over here is also taking into account campus partners. Are there any spaces that our students are already tapping into where they're already learning about creating that climate inclusion, respect, kindness in the classroom, et cetera? So I'm thinking, for example, of like Cal Nerds, where Diana Lizarraga is a director. So I would tap to their resource and say, hey, do you have any students that perhaps we would want to recruit to be part of our GSI group, right? Is there any sort of maybe program that we can create? Because, the type of pedagogy that you're instilling in the students is very much similar or the same to what we're trying to do. So that's one pathway that I can see also about making that even more possible.
And I'm thinking also about our UGSIs, our undergraduate student instructors. I mean, what a resource and what potential there is to work with them to accomplish a lot of these. How are the UGSIs selected? How are they trained? I mean, these are questions that I don't know the answer to, but Gordon, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, so one other thing that I think is important that doesn't necessarily have to do with how early GSIs start, but it more has to do with how GSIs interact with the faculty members that they're teaching with. And so, for example, a lot of us have kind of already talked about the importance of kind of getting our feedback during the process. And so a lot of times when you get into a GSI position, graduate students aren't often asked what their opinion is. Even though we have like a lot of network, a lot of experiences, like talking to undergraduates within our discussion sections. And so just that communication and being open with us about like wanting to hear feedback throughout the semester, because like changes, like we did a lot of stuff throughout the semester too that wasn't just right before the semester started.
Yeah, we changed, in fact, we rearranged lectures and changed topics based upon things that were real time that were happening in the course. Now I know that we again, when we look at the differences and similarities, we could be much more nimble because of size, because we're not part of a sequence, and so on. But maybe there are versions of that can be done. What about the deeper dive as it relates to what goes on in discussion section? Are there some transferable, adaptable features of the deeper dive? Now we took up lecture time to do that, but I see that there are opportunities to maybe do similar sorts of things, but how feasible is that and how valuable is that in discussion sections? Or as part of the lab. Now I know that labs, in fact, are jam-packed in terms of the amount of material that needs to be covered. So let's talk about this. Are there transferable pieces, please?
Well, I'm going to turn it around and ask you. I think the deeper dive and asking for student feedback on what they're hearing and how it integrates with their prior knowledge is something that, well, I think it has high feasibility and also can work. It can translate from a class like MCB 15, which is an entry-level class, all the way through more advanced topics classes. So yes. I like the idea of implementing something like that. I'm curious about how students felt about those exercises and what they felt they got out of it.
So the pre's, the reflection exercises, I think a big part of the class was doing that, for me at least, because there was also the idea that there was no right or wrong answer, that it was like your answer. And for example, just like thinking through the lecture, because then what starts to happen is you fill out the questions and then you're looking forward to filling out the pre. So what you're doing during the time that a speaker is talking or speaking is thinking about those questions subconsciously. And I think it really does make a difference to think about, like, for example, like what I was describing earlier, that was me thinking about, oh, okay, what if the science that was done by people from another continent was what was valued and became the practice of science around the world? That was something I came up with by thinking about questions that came from the pre. And so, like, what if Africans were the people whose science became spread throughout the world? And thinking about, okay, what would I say to a younger version of myself about this particular topic? You know, it would have been great to know that science was not just there from the beginning of time. You know, this was like a very huge turning point for me as a scientist, and realizing that the moment you come into a space, what you bring with you counts, because the people who are in that space are what make the culture. So your culture is valid as well. And thinking about, you know, she was talking about Laura Nader. When she came in, she was talking about observing scientists kind of like from the view of an anthropologist and seeing their practices and seeing what they value and what they don't value. And to me, that was so interesting because I felt the same way, even though I'm within that community of science. And so these are questions that came from having a time to sit with the material that we just learned, but also pose questions to people who came in to speak to us, and also pose questions to like, you know, our instructors, and give responses to these deeper dive questions. So the fact that we got to be listened to, and not just in a sense of like listen to as in doing what we're saying, but listen to as in my voice counts in this class and other people saying and interacting as well, and also like stepping back and seeing what other people have to say, just made for a richer experience in general. So it was really relevant. I don't think the course would have had the effect that it had on me had we not had a chance to do those reflection exercises and really think about what those concepts meant to us. Yeah.
How does that translate into what you teach? Yes.
I think that's what I'm having trouble with, because I mean, I'm thinking about a laboratory course that's very kind of technique based and so forth, and I really like the idea of kind of turning it to the students to say, what would you like to have learned or about this? How does this technique interact with what you've already learned? What would you like to know that you didn't already know? But it's a little bit hard for me to see how it translates, from a course that's more about kind of the anthropology of science to the actual kind of the technology of science and the practice of science.
So one thing I'm thinking about, having taken lab classes as well, is the fact that when you go to lab, there is a right answer. That's not how research works. When you go in, thinking about chemistry labs, for example, when you do your calculations and when you do your weights, even if your machine is faulty, there is a right answer. When you do your titrations, there is a right volume and stuff like that, or biology. And so I think that for me, the way that I would translate is, here is the objective of this lab, for example, and if you're doing something with that, so like lipid or membranes, for example, here is the objective. Here is what you might have learned in lecture. This is how this technique works. So you do the technique, but also connecting it to the class material in the way that ideally it would be, right? Which is, you're supposed to learn a concept in class and come to lab and use a principle from that concept to perform an experiment and see how that works out, and trying to tie in the two, because oftentimes they're sort of isolated in a very real way. So I know it's valuable for me to make those connections by myself. Like when I go back, I can be like, okay, I just did a calorimetry experiment. That is how it relates to this particular equation. But having that built into the course and the lab, the lab material itself, and then thinking about, okay, how do scientists use this in their labs, right? And what experiments do they come up with, or what papers has this technique been used in, and what data comes from that, and how would this tell you something interesting about a question you're, thinking about. So that could be something that they come in with, is I don't know, look up literature or papers that have used this particular technique. Oh, what did they find, as sort of an extra step to make that more relevant to them, and connecting things that they had learned from lecture to the class. So it's not just coming in, not that that's what it is. I'm from community college, so I don't know how it's done here, but it's not just coming in and my experiences, trying to get the right answer and trying to get the little sheet filled out, and then turning that in, and then treating your lecture like it's completely separate from the lab. Because if I had known that PCR is used so often in lab, even without having research experience, that might have motivated me to be more wow, I really want to know what this is exactly, because look at all the cool things that it's used to do, and look at how often it's used in research labs.
So I guess what I'm hearing is that context and connections, whether the context and connections are local, like between lecture and lab, or broader. And so maybe that's a way to think about how to do that, because that's what we've been doing in MCB 15, but this is different, as you pointed out. Okay.
I think there's a wonderful sense of wonder that comes with learning a new lab technique and knowing the trial and error through history that emerged to this instrument that we now use, and that how is it going to change over time? What are some of the limitations of this? Critiquing the instrument and the method itself and what its strengths and limitations are, the ways in which scientists may extrapolate beyond what the actual results say and interpreting the results. Those are all sociological, anthropological perspectives that connect to the technique and could just be referenced, I think, in a way to, if they're not already, to enrich the conversation.
Hi. Even kind of a bigger scale is we never really. I'm a grad student, and so even as
what department?
In integrated biology, and even as an undergrad, you sort of learn this is the scientific process. But I was really thinking about what Ife was saying about the history of science, and we learn like kind of recent historical figures who did specific experiments and things, but we don't go back farther to like what is science and where did it come from, and even just knowing like the experimental process that we always learn as dogma, that was developed over time by people. I have no idea actually, but that would be useful to know, and I think it would help students from what you guys are saying connect with the process of science, because it was it's not like it was written in a book and therefore we do it. So we kind of, I think that there's a lot of ways actually that I can see integrating these into even a lab, and even in the labs I've taught, we do like a 20-minute lecture or something at the beginning, and I'm thinking about how we do that because we say, okay, we want to give as much information as possible, and it feels wrong to change that and give them less information in some ways, but I'm thinking then if this information isn't reaching everyone equally or isn't reaching anyone at all maybe, then it's worth it to ditch that 20 minutes and use that 20 minutes for something else, like a mini deeper dive for 20 minutes, I think, even before a lab.
Okay, interesting. So this constant struggle between, just how much time do you allocate aside from focusing on content? And I think content is, but content without context, maybe that is a way to kind of think about this. When you talk about, knowing the recent history, but not the longer term history, the context is really important to understand the evolution of thought and instrumentation, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
I think understanding that evolution is also really important for the personal aspect of science. So understanding that when you walk into a lab, if your first PCR doesn't work and your cloning is a mess, it's not your fault. It happens sometimes. And that science doesn't always work the way that you think it's going to. And it's a process of trial and error. And even, the Nobel Prize winners have experienced that. And so bringing that into the classroom and showing students that the sort of scientific failures, quote unquote, are kind of successes in a way, and that they're doing okay is really, really valuable.
Yeah, I guess I would ask, like, how do we know that, like, in reality science doesn't work, but then like have a grade attached to how well your experiment works in lab, right? That's sort of like the intuition or the thinking that I'm sort of thinking, because when I started working in a lab, it takes a while, because then you have to unlearn the push to equate how well or whether or not an experiment works, which in and of itself is a question. That's a question, is like, what do you mean by an experiment worked? You got the results you got. How do you think about whether or not that's true? I had to kind of unlearn the fact that this PCR didn't go the way it was supposed to doesn't mean that my experiment fails. It just means I need to go back and retrace the steps and try to figure out what exactly went wrong. But then if that was something that had happened where I had a very specified or specific like protocol to follow to get this done, and then it didn't happen, I don't get that opportunity to do that because my grade is at stake. So I'm sitting there thinking, this PCR just failed. This is a failure. I'm a failure. And then you sort of take it personally, you internalize it, because that's sort of what comes from, being graded in class. And so it just so happens that like the process of doing labs outside of actual research labs is graded. And also, when you actually go to do the research, it's like, well, now this failed, that's bad, I'm a bad scientist, as opposed to thinking like that's just how research goes and that's how science goes, and people take decades to figure these things out and they fail so many times along the way. And how do we think about that from our lab classes? Like if we are going to work in a research lab, how are we prepared from taking lab classes to sort of move into that sort of situation? So who decides who gets grades for labs?
Some of the greatest experiments were ones that didn't give the expected result, and you don't see something that you do expect. And a great deal of our effort is to design experiments so we can have an idea how much we can trust the result. And so that's very important in laboratory courses, what kinds of controls they're called are going on simultaneously with the experiment so we can trust the result that comes out of the experiment and then go from there.
I love that idea of trust too. Like we do have to trust our results, and if it's not what we're expecting, how do we have a conversation with students about that? Mm-hmm.
Avi.
Yeah, the grad division and your departments that all offer workshops, but they're mostly skill-based workshops on how to develop, to improve your GSI. This issue of context, I'm curious about why we don't leverage existing resources. So OHST and CSTMS, which is the Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Studies, right here in Stevens, has a lot of visiting scholars and grad students working on issues in sociology of science. Why can't we task them with developing a 290? Or that would be a great excuse for them to provide some support for some of their students to teach us 290 that gives the context that you're all talking about. That even at the both undergrad and grad level, a lot of you that are in the hard sciences are surprised to hear about, oh my gosh, the things in my textbooks have a history. Well, we've got people here who are experts in parsing that history and revealing it. So why can't we task them with developing either a 290 or some kind of a workshop series that would be aimed not at anthropology and poli-sci students, who are most of the people that take CSTMS classes, but at science grads or people who expect to be have GSI requirements to fulfill their graduate programs.
Thank you.
So connect with, and I'd be happy to. Yeah, I'd be happy to try to web together some of those connections with CSTMS.
And so, Avi, your role at the university, please.
Yeah, I'm the student affairs officer for NANO, which is a graduate program that's structurally multidisciplinary. It's because we have a commitment from chemistry and from physics and from engineering for graduate students who are pursuing PhDs in 10 different departments who all have a nano connection. So my focus has always been on building connections between different departments on campus. CSTMS is the Center for Science Technology Center for Science and Technology Studies, Science, Technology, and Medicine Studies, CSTMS. Their office space is in Stevens, and they're the outgrowth of OHST, the Office for the History of Science and Technology, which is a specific program separate from Anthro and separate from Soc that specifically looks at the context of science, history of science.
Thank you.
I love that idea of tasking people who are already doing that background work with developing a course. I would add to include graduate students from STEM who want to learn to co-construct whatever seminar series or training that could emerge from that partnership. So students in STEM who are also interested in going a little bit deeper beyond just passively attending a seminar can have that opportunity to get to learn about it as well. Yeah.
Jules.
I help co-coordinate a large introductory biology course, Bio1B, that has 700 students, and then we have 30 to 40 graduate students or instructors who oversee it. And I'm wondering, in terms of transferability, if anybody has any ideas about helping get all of our 30 to 40 instructors for at least the lab section of the course on the same page about these ideas. I think trainings, workshops, et cetera, are really great. But I think that Dax kind of touched on this earlier, that you know, we have a lot of people coming in who are super enthusiastic to help work in this course, and others who aren't as much. And we're not at the point that we can hire based on that enthusiasm. And I want the experience to be beneficial to everybody based on their own priorities for why they're there to help the students. And just how can we help them get to some matched level of understanding and bringing that to some consistent level to the students across all the sections that are getting taught?
That's a great question. Yeah.
Well, just one thought is that some of those graduate student instructors who might not be super excited about teaching are maybe really into science, though. Maybe that's why they're there. And so, like it was said in the presentations today, incorporating evidence, papers on these topics about pedagogy and, I don't know, all of this stuff, you know, showing them the data and convincing them that way it might help.
Another idea that comes to my mind in the packet, we didn't discuss it, but there's the skills self-inventory that we provide to the undergraduate students in facilitating the process of coming up with a project in the course. And what I love about this like self-inventory is it's thinking about what are the things that you're interested in? What do you see as your strengths? Where do you see room for growth and development? And I could imagine graduate students who are coming to Berkeley maybe haven't been asked those questions. Some people may have an advisor who's taken them through that dialogue, but maybe they haven't. Giving them the opportunity to voice where they're at, where they'd like to contribute, what their interests are, and co-constructing that along with the graduate students who may be less interested. It may be just figuring out what are their interests.
So I want to say something about making it easier to do good. Right now, it's really, really hard to read the primary literature surrounding inclusion. And Mika and I and Missy Soto in the back there, Deputy Director of BSP, we have a vision of creating a center. And Karen, I'm going to ask Mika to speak about the center, the Inclusive Excellence Center that we have planned, because the question is a good one, Jules. How do you help people sort of do well for more students if their interest is primarily science, but maybe there's an inkling that they would like to do more? And so how do we do that? How do we make it easier for them?
That's a big question. Well, I think the idea of the center comes from, I don't know, for those of you who don't know me or don't know my work, I have been studying how students integrate into their professional communities. And I have done longitudinal studies showing that people who develop a professional identity around the area that they're interested in, that they're more likely to continue on in their profession. And that, so the social matters. There's a lot, it's important that people can do it, which is the efficacy, but it's also, and actually is more strongly predictive, is whether they develop this sense of identity and whether the values of their profession really matter to them. And these are really simple things that doesn't mean you have to change your course content. It just means that you are framing what you're teaching in a different way, which I think is what most of today has been about, is not necessarily that we change what science is, but do we frame it in a way that is more inclusive and more responsive to people's true values. So the idea of having a center here is to really support people who are on the ground teaching, advising, mentoring, developing programs, co-curricular programs, so that they don't have to start from ground zero and make it up. There's a lot of, happens to me all the time nationally, very committed science STEM teachers who are doing the best they can, and they have no idea that there's this rich amount of research and knowledge that we already have, that with a little bit of help, they, instead of having to start from ground zero, they could start much higher, much more running faster if they had some. So the idea of a center would be to have that material available, to provide workshops and online and also in person that would help people and support people who are starting programs. So if you have a new professor who just got a new grant to run a RISE program in the middle of Nebraska and they don't know, they could learn from the things that have been already learned from other programs that have been effective, and to really support people who are working in that direction. The last thing I'll say is that I've been serving on a National Academy Committee roundtable that's on institutional transformation in STEM. And we know that there's two major disruptors happening at institutions, academic institutions. One, of course, is technology, which was mentioned in the early slides. People with their computers on and they can get lectures, and I mean the whole thing has changed, as anybody who's teaching in a classroom knows. And the second thing is that diversity of the students has really changed. And everybody knows, I think, at the national level who's in education, and probably many of you already know this too, that the technological disruption and the diversity of students are the two biggest challenges that we face. So the center would really be focused on helping educators adapt to the changing learners. Because the majority of learners are not coming right out of high school and going straight into college. That's not happening anymore. They're mid-career, they are going to community colleges, they're dropping out for a while, they're older, they're definitely more diverse, and there's a lot of changes happening. So the center would be helping people to respond to those big disruptors that are happening.
Thanks, Mika. So, this is our aspiration, to have an Inclusive Excellence Resource Center here at Berkeley to help Jules and others work with their GSIs, to help work with faculty who want to do this in their classrooms, but don't have the time because of competing demands. And I think this is something that we almost had money to do this, but it was a near miss, but we haven't given up yet. But this is we have an aspirational culture, and so we have hope, and we want to do this. And I think this would be in service of many of the things that you're thinking about doing, but maybe don't have the way to do those things quite yet. Please, Madeline.
That sounds fantastic. And I guess in the meantime, one thing that we've done in courses I've GSI'd has been to have a Dropbox or have a Google Drive where we share resources among GSIs, so that if one person has an idea for section that week that is really great, they can share it with other people. Or if there are past handouts and questions that GSIs have come up with, they then become a resource for future GSIs, so that the course continues to get better as it goes on, rather than each new group of teachers and GSIs reinventing the wheel, sort of.
Got it.
And that's been a huge resource for me.
Good. Thanks, Madeline. Any other questions? Please, Mika.
One of the things in the proposal that we had done that I have just a feeling around is, one of the things that we have not really done at a national level is really articulate what an inclusively excellent academic environment is like. And I'm in the process of writing something right now, which we put in the proposal, which has to do with the whole person. And meaning that an ideal classroom or institution would include these things. And you can just think about this as you walk out the door, and you can always contact me and tell me if I'm missing something. But it has to do with heart, mind, body, soul, right? So in terms of the heart, do people feel in their classrooms and in their academic environment inclusion and belonging? Are they actually having that experience? And that speaks to some of the stuff that John was talking about earlier. To the mind, are people learning what they need to learn? Are they acquiring the knowledge and the skills that they need in their classroom? Everybody equally. The third has to do with the physical. Is there representation? Is there just physical representation of people like yourself in your classrooms, in your institution? And the last has to do with spirit, which has to do with creativity and meaning. Does everybody in your university have equal opportunity for creativity and meaning? And the core thought is that in our classes and in our institutions, what we most would like to have is this feeling of belonging and inclusion, that we're learning well, that there's people like us around us that will understand who we are, and that we have meaning and creativity happening. And that if I was in that environment, I would be really happy. And so one of the core elements of the center is to do the science and the research and the workshops and all of those things to try to manifest that in our institutions.
Thank you, Mika. So any final comments or questions as we bring this to a close? So let me say one final thing. There, on the last page of your handout, there is an evaluation that Mika has put together. If you could fill that out and hand it in before you leave today, we'd appreciate it. We want to know what worked, what didn't, how we can get better at this. And this, in fact, is the first in a series of seminars. Our next seminar is going to be, workshop is going to be on advising. And that's going to be happening in November. And so, any other final words from our panelists here? Anything?
Are we good? Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you.